Fame creates silence. Applause covers everything. In the golden age of classic rock, there were no rules, only access. Fans weren't just listeners. They were invitations. They were trophies. They were invisible. What was once called freedom was often power without consequence. Backstage doors closed. Stories disappeared. And the world applauded louder. Tonight, this isn't about legends. It's about what fame allowed down no one questioned. Mick Jagger rock stardom, as Access Mick Jagger, was one of the figures who effectively dismantled the myth of rock star unattainability. During the Rolling Stones' peak years, the stage wasn't merely a place for music. It was a platform where desire, power, and status materialized. Relationships with fans during tours had become almost normalized in the rock culture of that era. Nobody asked why, because it was Mick Jagger. Looking back today, it's clear these relationships weren't simply about mutual attraction. There was a massive power asymmetry between the figure on stage and the individual in the audience. Jagger's charisma and cultural influence blurred the boundaries between admiration and desire. His status as a rock icon automatically created a gravitational pull that fundamentally shaped the nature of these interactions from the start. Jimmy Page power. Myth and silence. Jimmy Page is remembered as Led Zeppelin's musical genius. Yet his private life remained shrouded in darkness for years. The groupie culture that revolved around the band in the 70s took on a more intense and controversial character around Page. These relationships were romanticized for decades, dismissed as the spirit of the times. But this romanticization obscured what actually happened and prevented any questioning. But it wasn't just about hedonism. The authority on stage continued backstage. Page's status became a defining factor in relationships with fans. His virtuosity on guitar and dark stage image gave him an almost mythological aura. This myth deepened the real-life power imbalance even further. For fans, spending time with a Led Zeppelin member wasn't just a personal experience. It meant becoming part of rock history itself. Gene Simmons, no shame, no denial. Gene Simmons was different because he never hid it. KISS's image was built entirely on sexuality, accessibility, and fantasy. Rather than keeping his relationships with fans secret, Simmons narrated them as if they were a natural consequence of rock stardom. He even bragged about numbers in interviews, spoke openly, and branded his own lifestyle. This openness set him apart from others while also placing him at the center of criticism. For Simmons, these relationships were consensual, but the question of how consent is shaped by power went unasked for too long. The stage persona opened doors in real life. KISS's theatrical shows, makeup, and stage costumes seemed to transport the band beyond the rules of the real world. In this fantasy realm, normal social boundaries appeared suspended. The Gene Simmons case shows how boundaries in rock culture became a marketing strategy. KISS's success wasn't based solely on music, but on the mythology they created. At the center of this mythology was the idea of accessible fantasy. When fans attended a Kiss concert, they weren't just buying a musical experience, they were purchasing entry into another world. This story isn't a scandal, it's a confession of how a system openly operated. Simmons's candor was seen by some as honesty, while for others, it exemplified the normalization of these behaviors. He was saying out loud what other rock stars did quietly. Steven Tyler, fame and controls. Steven Namos, Tyven, demonstrates how thin the line is between rock stardom and personal chaos. During Aerosmith's rise, Tyler made headlines with his life off stage as well. Relationships with fans were long presented as part of the rebel rock star image. Tyler's energetic stage performances and characteristic vocal style made him a rock icon, while his private life became an inseparable part of that image. But as years passed, the tone of these stories changed. Control, addiction, and power dynamics came to the forefront. Tyler himself uses the word lack of control when looking back at his past. The chaos created by drug addiction and alcohol problems deeply affected his personal relationships. Tyler's story reveals how fame blurs personal boundaries and exposes the dark side of the rock star lifestyle. This narrative reveals how boundaries disappeared in the rock world and how this was a cultural problem. not just an individual one. Tyler's effort to confront his past holds up a mirror to the rest of rock history. Behaviors considered normal at the time are evaluated through a different lens today. Tyler's candid confessions have become part of both a personal reckoning and a generational accounting. His willingness to acknowledge past mistakes stands in contrast to many of his contemporaries who remain silent. David Lee Roth. Excess as identity. For David Lee Roth, excess wasn't a byproduct, it was his identity. During Van Halen's peak, Roth lived his backstage life as theatrically as his stage performances. Relationships with fans were presented as a rock star perk. Roth's stage performances were filled with acrobatic moves, flashy costumes, and boundless energy. That energy continued off stage as well. This was narrated as entertaining anecdotes, till you looked at the power imbalance. Roth's charisma and access predetermined the nature of these relationships. Van Halen's backstage was legendary for its wild parties, and Roth was at the very center of this culture. For him, rock stardom wasn't just about making music, it was a complete lifestyle. And that lifestyle meant unlimited access and opportunities. Today, these stories serve as an archive for understanding how rock culture sanctified hedonism. Roth's candor and playful demeanor might make these behaviors seem more innocent, but the underlying power dynamics were the same. The music industry of the 80s encouraged and even rewarded such excesses. Roth was a perfect product of the system and, simultaneously, its most transparent representative. His attitude reflected an era when excess was celebrated rather than questioned. Iggy Pop. No distance between stage and crowd for Iggy Pop. There was never a clear line between stage and audience. His physical exposure, boundary-breaking performances, and physical contact with viewers were the essence of punk spirit. This proximity caused admiration and desire to become intertwined. In Iggy Pop's world, there was no distance, neither physical nor emotional. This was celebrated as freedom, but it also showed how boundaries dissolved. The punk ethos rejected conventional norms, and this extended to personal interactions. What seemed like liberation also created a space where traditional boundaries became meaningless. Iggy's stage diving, crowd surfing, and self-destructive performances weren't just entertainment. They were a philosophy of total engagement that extended into every aspect of his life. The same lack of boundaries that made his performances legendary also shaped his personal relationships in ways that were complex and often problematic. Rod Stewart, rock star, romanticism. Rod Stewart's image was more romantic, but the background was similar. Relationships with fans in the 70s appeared in the tabloid press as almost charming stories. The media portrayed him as a lovable ladies' man, rather than examining the underlying dynamics. His smooth voice and seemingly gentlemanly demeanor created a narrative that felt less aggressive than other rock stars, but romanticism made the power imbalance invisible. The Stewart case shows that even a softer image can be part of the same system. His smooth voice and gentleman persona created a different narrative, but the fundamental power dynamics remained unchanged. The veneer of romance and charm obscured the fact that the same structural inequalities existed. In some ways, the romanticized version of these relationships was more insidious because it made the power imbalance harder to recognize and critique. Axel Rose. Chaos and control. Axel Rose's relationships were remembered alongside his anger and control issues. Fame made this control even more complex. Relationships with fans were intertwined with emotional intensity and power. His volatile temperament and legendary outbursts created an atmosphere where personal boundaries became unclear. These stories represent the dark side of rock stardom, where artistic genius and personal dysfunction became inseparable. The chaos that defined Guns N' Roses extended into Rose's personal life. His unpredictability and emotional instability created relationships marked by intensity rather than stability. The same passion that fueled his performances also characterized his personal interactions, often with destructive results. Rose's story illustrates how fame can amplify existing issues with control and boundaries. Elvis Presley. The first idol Elvis was the starting point of modern fan culture. Absolute idolization predetermined relationship dynamics from the beginning. As the first true rock and roll superstar, he established patterns that would be repeated for generations. The screaming fans, the unprecedented hysteria, the complete devotion, all of This created a template for how rock stars would interact with their admirers. His story is critical to understanding how the system began. Elvis didn't just start a musical revolution. He initiated a new kind of relationship between performer and audience. The intensity of fan devotion reached levels never seen before, and this changed the fundamental nature of celebrity. Elvis existed in a world where the normal rules didn't seem to apply, where his desires and impulses were rarely questioned. This set a precedent that would shape rock culture for decades to come. Jim Morrison, myth over reality. Jim Morrison's relationships with fans were an inseparable part of the Doors' legend. Poetry, alcohol, and chaos merged into a narrative that prioritized myth over reality. Morrison cultivated an image as a poet shaman, a mystical figure who existed beyond conventional morality. But behind this myth lies an era when power and access went unquestioned. Morrison's persona as the tortured artist created a mystique that obscured the actual dynamics at play. The Doors' mythology, carefully cultivated through music and image, made it difficult to see the human relationships beneath the legend. His early death only enhanced the myth, preventing the kind of reckoning that other aging rock stars would eventually face. Morrison remains frozen in time, forever young and forever mythologized, with the uncomfortable realities often overshadowed by the legend. History didn't forget. It just chose not to look. Many of these stories were never normalized, excused as culture, protected by success, buried under nostalgia. This isn't about erasing music. It's about separating talent from behavior and understanding how easily admiration becomes permission. The songs still play. The myths still survive. Silence is finally breaking, and once you see it, you can't unsee it.